I will be introducing Dana Berkowitz. She's an associate professor of sociology and women's and gender studies at Louisiana State University. She received her PhD in sociology with a certificate in women's and gender studies from the University of Florida in 2007. She is the author of Botox Nation, Changing the Face of America, which was published by NYU Press. Scholarship has also appeared in high-impact journals such as Journal of Marriage and Family, Qualitative Health Research, Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, Qualitative Sociology, and Symbolic Interaction. Please help me welcome Dana to the podium.
Thank you so much. Hi, how's the mic? Good? Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me here and for welcoming me to your university and to your city, which fortunately is a lot less cold than I thought it was gonna be. So without further ado, I'm just gonna jump into it. And oh, I should also warn you that I am a little bit sick, so if I cough or sneeze, I apologize in advance, okay? So let's just dive right into it. Okay, so let me just give you a little, how many of you have read the book, actually? Okay, this side. Okay, so this side of the room knows a little bit more than the rest. So for those of you here, you might not know all about Botox, so I'm gonna give you a little background. Okay, so what is Botox? What is Botox anyway? Okay. So Botox is a neurotoxin, and it's injected into the facial muscles, and what it does is it blocks the signals from the nerves to the muscles. And in so doing, it prohibits facial movement. So the idea is that no movement equal no wrinkles. So if it's injected into these muscles right here, okay, these are called the 11s, or if you wait too long, the 111s. And so it's injected right here into the nerve, and so into the muscle rather, paralyzing the nerve, and then you can't make this movement, these expressions that we love to make all the time. And so if you can't move that, this part of your face, you won't get these deeply etched lines that form, the 11s or 111s. And it works. There's a few caveats that we'll talk about really soon, but for the sake of argument right now, let's just say it works. And because it works, it is considered the preeminent remedy for expression lines on the upper part of the face, okay? Botox is fairly new, okay? It was FDA approved for the glabellar lines, that's these, in 2002, and later it was approved for crow's feet. We have all these names for wrinkles, right, and bunny lines. And so since it was FDA approved in 2002, it has been the most popular cosmetic procedure to date. It has transformed this battleground against aging. There have been 11 million Botox users during this time. And just to have you see how many of these are repeat offenders. There were over 7 million procedures in 2017 alone. Okay, and it exhibited an 800% increase between 2000, even before it was FDA approved, and 2017. And the reason why we've seen such an increase in the use of the drug is that it's widely marketed as a quick, easy, safe, and reliable way to temporarily improve moderate to severe frown lines. It's also marketed as appealing to the American every woman, not just the economically prosperous or socially ambitious. I want to note that a very small proportion of our population in relative terms uses Botox, okay? It's not that common. However, its cultural significance is widespread. And it's firmly entrenched in our vernacular, in our cultural consciousness, so much that we use it as an adjective, as in she's so Botoxed, okay? So of all the cosmetic enhancements and anti-aging procedures that are out there, Botox is really the one people sort of know the word, right? They're most familiar with it, okay? So who is using Botox? I'm going to just give you some racial, ethnic, and gender demographics of Botox users. So 75% of Botox users are white, and 25% are racial and ethnic minorities. Of this 25%, 9% are Latina, 5% are Black, 4% are Asian, and then the remainder are other. So it is mostly white women who are using Botox, and it is mostly women. It is an explicitly gendered phenomenon. Over 94% of Botox users are women. So I have sections of my book where I talk about men, I talk about the 6% of male users, and I talk about the marketing of Botox for men, which is called Brotox. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about it today, but if you have any questions about it, I'll be happy to answer it in the Q&A. Okay. Excuse me, like most cosmetic procedures, the bulk are practiced by middle-aged women, ages 40 to 54. About 60% of Botox users are ages 40 to 54. However, 20% of users are between the ages of 19 and 39. And this is who I'm really interested in this book. This is 1.2 million women, because it's not really a small number. But this is who I'm most interested in studying. Because when I started researching this book almost 10 years ago, I was in my early 30s. And I had lots of friends who were getting Botox, and I was just blown away that this was something that women in their early 30s were supposed to be doing. And so these women make up the majority of my sample, and I pay close attention to the marketing and selling of Botox to these women. And what sets Botox apart from all the other anti-aging interventions is that Allergan is the pharmaceutical company that owns and manufactures Botox. So Allergan seduces its young consumer base with claims that Botox does not simply eradicate wrinkles, but it can prevent them from forming by forbidding the face to muster these wrinkle-producing scowls, these expressions that I'm making right now. So because of Botox's ability to paralyze facial muscles and prohibit facial movement, proponents of the drug argue that regular injections can stop the appearance of dynamic wrinkles from forming. So notable populations of young women are using Botox prophylactically in the hopes that they won't develop future facial creases. So women without notable facial creases are still using the drug in the hopes that they won't get these wrinkles in the future. Okay, but remember I told you it works, but there's caveat. Well, here's the caveat. It's temporary. Botox lasts only 4 to 6 months. So it's only preventative to the extent that you keep going back for more, okay? And so because they're only temporary, and you have to go back, and you need to continuously top it off, what we're seeing is this creation of the lifetime consumer, okay, of a woman who starts in her early 30s and then gets hooked like any drug, right? And then continues to get Botox, and then Botox often is a gateway drug into other procedures, and I'll talk about that later. Okay. So I want to note something about social class. So I've talked about race and ethnicity and gender, and I want to note something about social class. Unfortunately, we have no information on social class and cosmetic procedures. Nobody collects data on that. But the fact that it is relatively cost prohibitive, it's not as expensive as a facelift, in that it costs about $300 to $500 each time. It is a relatively privileged practice because you have to keep going multiple times a year. So it can be about $1,000 a year, okay? So given this, it is, just because Botox is marketed to the American every woman, it's really the American white upper middle class woman, okay? So who's providing Botox? Well, a lot of people. Do you have any medical spas here in Portland? Yeah, they're popping up everywhere, right? In strip malls next to Starbucks. Yeah. So on one end, you have, excuse me, dermatologists and plastic surgeons who've always been doing this sort of thing, right? And then on the other end, though, you have a rise in non-specializing physicians like emergency room physicians, OB-GYNs. You also have dentists, nurse practitioners, estheticians, okay? There's no federal regulation as to who is allowed to inject or provide Botox. There was a joke that I was gonna come and inject you guys today. Not that kind of doctor, no. But so there's no federal regulation, so this is all done state by state, okay? And this is part of the reason why we're seeing such an increase in Botox is because you're seeing so many other physicians and non-physicians injecting the drug. And it's because it's a cash cow. It's because it's billed as a cosmetic procedure, so there's no health insurance costs with which to deal. And I have a chapter in my book about the turf wars amongst these varying practitioners. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about it today, but again, if you want to know more about it, I'll be happy to answer it in the Q&A. So, how is Botox changing the face of America? The impact of Botox on American society is evident, not just on people's faces, in the media, and in the massive advertising and marketing campaigns, but also in the ways that it runs throughout our cultural commentary. In a literal sense, Botox is changing the face of America in its reduction and erasure of forehead wrinkles among a growing percentage of the population. In a more metaphorical sense, Botox is changing the face of America in the way that it has transformed people's expectations about aging faces, especially aging women's faces. So now that you have background and you understand what Botox is, why it's important, how prevalent it is, etc., I'm going to go through an outline of today's talk. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the book. And I'm going to talk about the marketing of Botox, and then I'm going to move into my interviews with Botox users and talk about the process through which one becomes a Botox user, the visceral experience of what it feels like to be in the Botox body, and the ways that users accounted for their Botox use. So the normalization of Botox. Scholars have documented that we're seeing an increasing normalization in cosmetic surgery. In media, TV, okay, we have, makeover shows and whatnot, and you have, manufactured celebrities getting Botox injections and fillers on TV. And so when I say manufactured celebrities, I mean like the Real Housewives or the Kardashians. And so I found that in my analysis of media, that Botox injections, even more so than cosmetic surgery in general, was perpetually normalized. Okay? And so I saw some narratives like this in magazines. Botox injections have become an appointment many of us greet every few months with about as much ceremony as a manicure. And then that was in Vogue. And then in People magazine, I don't know why people want to make a controversy about Botox. It's a basic thing, like getting a manicure or getting your hair dyed. It's on the grooming checklist. It's part of the game. Okay. And part of the reason why Botox was so normalized, even more so than cosmetic surgery, was it's billed as quick, it's billed as easy, it's less expensive, it can be administered over a lunch break, there's no downtime. So in addition to Botox becoming increasingly normalized, I also saw in celebrity tabloids, in women's magazines, and in news sources that not having work done was now the new shame. Yeah. So narratives in magazines about Botox were colored with themes of individual responsibility, moral obligation, and at times feelings of inadequacy and personal failure. So this was from a journalist in Marie Claire. She said, "Was it now uncouth of me to show up at dinner with my fine lines? Was this akin to showing up with mud on my boots and a moth hole in my sweater? 10 years ago, I might have splurged on a manicure and had my hair blow dry before a formal dinner party. Was I now obliged to add Botox and fillers to the routine?" So confessionary tales such as this one emphasize a moral violation in not participating in aesthetic labor. Botox, laser treatments, dermal filler, these were presented in media accounts as normalized way of performing femininity and of neoliberal citizenship. Not only do they accentuate a woman's personal responsibility for managing her exterior body, they also implied that attending to one's physical appearance through the consumption of an ever-expanding technological toolkit was compulsory for status and inclusion. So when I interviewed Botox providers, I was curious about how they were going to frame Botox. And many of the providers that I spoke with also interlaced their narratives with repertoires of responsible self-care. For example, when I interviewed Sonia James, a dermatologist in New Orleans, and I asked her what she would say to me. I was 32 years old at the time. I colored my hair to camouflage my gray roots. I used topical creams and serums, and I was concerned about the onset effects of aging. I had already, I just spent the entire summer reading all these magazines, analyzing them, so I was even more concerned. But I told her I wasn't ready to begin Botox injections, and her response stunned me. She said, "I would say you're being negligent. Botox is almost a requirement. If you make enough money to afford it, it should be one of those affordable luxuries. It's still luxury, but it's something that you should have in your budget. For women, I always say, skincare is first. Sunscreen, Retin-A, antioxidants, and the next dollar you spend should be Botox." Literally. So, evoking the mandate that a responsible woman consumer was required to make Botox a priority, no matter how dire her financial situation, I had only been out of grad school for a few years. I didn't have the disposable income to spend $1,000 a year on Botox. So, Dr. James projected the imperative that even women who are poor and economically struggling, they should scrimp, save, or use their credit cards and go into further debt to get Botox shots, almost as if Botox were on par with material provisions like food and shelter. Women who refused to go under the needle were presented as failing to follow normative prescriptions of femininity and stigmatized as lazy and irresponsible. So now I'm going to show you some advertisements. I apologize, this one is not the best quality. It actually looks a lot better on there. And so you can see that it says it took 40 years to get it and 10 minutes to do something about it. So this idea that letting yourself go was a personal choice was very much reflected in Botox's advertising campaigns. Couched within these discourses of responsibility, these marketing tactics held individual women responsible and accountable for succeeding in erasing the wrinkles or for failing to do so. So they're projecting this message that control over our aging faces is putatively in our own grasp. If we choose to live with our wrinkles, we are complicit in our own aging. And thus we have consciously chosen to fail to live up to normative standards of femininity. However, I think it's reasonable to say that this focus on personal responsibility really obscures structural constraints and who can afford to do this. Okay, we live in a society with massive social inequality where most women, don't have access to basic health care, let alone money to purchase cosmetic enhancements like Botox. Okay. And so now I'm going to show you another advertisement. This says, everybody has their own reason for looking into Botox cosmetic. If you haven't called your doctor yet, isn't it about time? Okay, this is my time, I've waited long enough. So this is another advertisement that projects Botox as a personal, responsible, and empowered choice. Okay? And I want you to pay attention to these marketing discourses because they're going to resurface again when I talk about users' narratives and how they accounted for their participation and their use of Botox. So Botox was regularly situated within this ethos of preventative aesthetics. The phrase preventative Botox has been around for almost as long as the drug itself, right? This is how it's marketed to young women. And so a growing contingent of young Botox consumers are being advised that the best time is to start using Botox is when their wrinkles are minimally visible. And so this is why procedures in the 19 to 34 demographic have more than doubled in the past decade. So I read narratives and quotes like this in magazines. Think of yourself as a house. The house ages, the foundation cracks, the internal structure starts falling down. A lot of women wait until their house has collapsed and then they want to fix it. Then there's this one from a 25-year-old doctoral student who was quoted in Marie Claire magazine. I get Botox injections every 4 to 5 months because a lot of women wait until they're in really bad shape. And that's kind of like saying, I'm gonna wait until I have a heart attack to go to the cardiologist. It's exactly like that, right? Botox is just like putting on sunscreen for me. So where sunscreen protects against skin cancer and visiting a cardiologist for routine screening can, manage the risk of heart disease, Botox injections are a cosmetic practice designed to stall the appearance of wrinkles. They have relatively nothing to do with our actual health, okay? But they were still marketed as a way by which you could and should prevent the onset appearance of aging, right? And we believe that our health is written on our body, so if we look good, we must be healthy. So now that I've given you a brief overview of how Botox is marketed and sold to women, I'm going to switch gears and talk about the processes through which one becomes a Botox user. So I'm going to read you a vignette, okay? This comes from a young woman who I interviewed in New Orleans who tried Botox for the first time when she was living in San Francisco. Her name is Micah Williamson. And she said, it was summer about 2 years ago, and a friend of mine had a party at her house. It was a Botox party. So that was a little risky, not doing it at a doctor's office, but at someone's house. But at this point in my life, I was kind of feeling like I had nothing to lose. And it was experimental, and I wanted to try it. And the girl who had done it before just raved about it. So I guess there were probably about 8 of us. She had us over for wine and food and stuff, and the doctor came with these 2 really attractive nurses. You could tell they all did it, and they all looked good. They gave us a really good deal, I guess. It was about $250 for each of us. So this story is neither unique nor remarkable. It shares a lot in common with many of the other first-time tales I heard during the course of my research. So decisions about whether to use Botox were prompted by a range of motivating factors, emotions, and situations. For some, it was triggered by a specific moment, such as finding out about a bargain on Botox, or spontaneously attending a Botox party. For others, it was motivated by the more gradual process of seeing oneself age. So where Micah's entree into Botox consumption was sudden, spontaneous, and impulsive, others were more gradual and calculated. And though I want you to notice that even though Micah had elicited this silent curiosity about Botox prior to her first time, she required that extra push that this Botox party gave her, that her friend gave her. And so her story highlights the importance of social networks in the process of becoming a Botox user to provide this valuable socialization through the transmission of shared knowledge. It also illustrates how a transitional moment, like finding out about a Botox party or getting a good deal on Botox, really activated users to try Botox, okay, and make this qualitative change in their behavior. So Botox is not cheap, okay? And so getting a good deal on Botox was the most important factor emphasized in users' first-time narratives. Okay, many people were not ready to spend upward of $300 on a procedure they hadn't yet tried. And so for many of the people with whom I spoke, their decisions to begin using Botox were prompted by receiving a Groupon. How many of you get Groupon emails? How many of you have gotten Groupons for Botox? Yeah. It's regional, so I don't necessarily know how common that is here, but I get Groupons for Botox, filler, CoolScope, laser, I mean, you name it. I've never bought one though. But so others told me about getting a good deal from a friend or acquaintance they knew that was a provider. And so I'm going to share one of these stories with you. Jules Mayer was a stylish, outgoing woman from Miami who I interviewed. She was 32 when I interviewed her. It was in 2010. And she was working as a concierge in a hotel. Our interview occurred during a difficult and tumultuous time during Jules' life. Her once lucrative career in finance had ended after the 2007-2008 recession, and she was back at home living with her mother, trying to make ends meet. In between her finance career and her concierge job, Jules worked for a year in medical sales. It was through her networks in medical sales that she was introduced to Botox because a medical spa that she was working with offered her 50% off. She was hooked. Even though she has since gotten back on her feet and is now a successful marketing director for a hotel chain, over the years, she has had to economize, finding creative, even irresponsible and dangerous ways to sustain her Botox habit. In 2001, she told me she was awaiting her tax return so she could get Botox again, even though she was drowning in credit card debt. Then, in 2012, she told me how she and her mother went to a Botox party where a doctor from Colombia injected a small group of mothers and daughters at a discounted rate. So like Jules, many of the stories that I heard from first-time users mirrored sociological research on illicit drug subcultures. Specifically in the ways that they were given this discounted taste and it was a one-time transaction. Okay? However, unlike the cultural imaginary associated with drug use, these Botox stories were for the most part a clean, even a glamorous affair. Here's an advertisement advertising Botox cosmetic for friends. Okay? And it says, you share everything with your best friends, now share your Botox cosmetic experience. And this advertisement is pretty spot on because 18 of the 35 users I interviewed tried Botox for the first time with a friend. And 4 tried Botox for the first time with their mothers. And so that the first time trying Botox was this collaborative, almost a ritualistic experience reveals how the process of becoming a Botox user is intimately interwoven with other relationships. So I found that users shared some common characteristics. Okay, they were drawn to Botox because of several intersecting social forces. First, they were profoundly bothered at the sight of their aging bodies. This is a quote from one of my participants. She said, when I think about aging, I think about my plastic surgeon on speed dial. Okay. Also, they were highly invested in their body projects. Botox was just one of many things that they did in terms of maintaining their bodies, manicures, pedicures, expensive gym memberships, Pilates classes, etc. Also, they were positioned within communities of practice where this type of body work was encouraged rather than stigmatized. So one woman who lived in New York said, I was at a charity event last week, and it was like literally the whole room had Botox. Instead of asking who in my social circle uses Botox, it's a matter of finding the person in the room who doesn't use Botox. Now, although the users in my samples shared some similarities, they were not all alike. While many lived in cosmopolitan cities, some did not. While many had disposable incomes and were part of the leisure class, some were not. While many came from families and peer groups where cosmetic surgical culture was normalized, accepted, and even encouraged, some did not. But each and every one of these users lived in locales where medical spas were popping up in strip malls next to Whole Foods and Starbucks, okay? These were the people who got daily emails advertising bargains on Botox. They were not rich, most of them, but they were not poor. They might not shop at Whole Foods all the time, but they did frequent Whole Foods. They might not be able to afford the clothing in Vogue or Harper's Bazaar that they were likely to flip through these magazines, okay? And these users are the demographic target for Allergan's vast and aggressive advertising campaign. And these are the faces of the rapidly growing population of Botox users. Okay. So now that we understand how one becomes a Botox user, okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about the visceral experience of what it feels like to be in the Botox body. Jean Carruthers, one of the discoverers of Botox, and if you have questions about the discovery, it's a really fascinating story. I'll tell you about it in the Q&A, said, "I haven't frowned since 1987. I have a picture of it." So before I tried Botox myself, I wondered if this was in fact true or if it was a Botox urban myth. And it turns out it's partly true. So when you have Botox, you can frown using the facial muscles on the bottom part of your face, but you just can't scowl or grimace using those facial muscles on the top part of your face. So what results is this very strange sort of mismatch, top half, bottom half of your face. So what does this mean for a sociologist studying Botox? Well, quite a bit, actually. So sociologists have long speculated on the meaning of human faces for social interaction. Irving Goffman, a prominent sociologist, developed the concept of face work to refer to the ways that human faces act as a template to invoke, process, and manage emotions. Botox's effect on expression may be particularly enticing to women who from early childhood are taught to project cheerfulness and to disguise unhappiness. Historically dislocated from the public sphere, from political power, and from leadership positions, women are penalized for looking speculative, judgmental, angry, or cross. Male politicians and CEOs are expected to look pissed off, stern, and annoyed. However, when Hillary Clinton displays these same exact expressions, she is chastised for being unladylike, as undeserving of the male gaze, and for disrupting the normative gender order. And nothing demonstrates this more than the recent pop cultural idioms, there's two, resting bitch face and bitchy resting face. For those unfamiliar with these not so subtly sexist terms, resting bitch face, according to the Urban Dictionary, is a person, usually a girl, who naturally looks mean when her face is expressionless, without meaning to. So resting bitch face and its linguistic cousin, bitchy resting face, are nowhere near gender neutral, right? There is no name for men's serious, pensive, and reserved expressions because we allow men these feelings. When a man looks severe, serious, or grumpy, we assume it's for good reason. But women are always expected to be smiling, aesthetically pleasing, and compliant. And this is what sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild calls emotion labor. This is a type of impression management which involves manipulating one's feelings to transmit a certain impression. Now, the face work involved in projecting cheerfulness and always smiling requires energy, and as any woman is well aware, can be quite exhausting. But enter Botox, the neurotoxin that can seemingly liberate the face from its resting bitch state, producing a flattening of affect where the act of appearing perplexed or pissed off is effaced and prevented from leaving a lasting impression. So what I argue is that one reason Botox may be especially appealing to women is that it can potentially relieve them from having to work so hard and police their expressions. So no more bitchy resting face work, okay? Even more insidiously, Botox can change how women feel. So there's a theory in psychology known as the facial feedback hypothesis. And this proposes that the control of facial expression produces parallel effects on subjective feelings. So if this is true, it follows that blocking negative expressions with Botox injections should offer some protection against negative affect. And in 2009, Andreas Henenlotter, a German scientist, conducted an experiment to test just this. Henenlotter had his female subjects, half of whom had Botox and half of whom served as a control group, imitate angry expressions in an MRI scanner. Not only were the women with Botox-impaired brows unable to make these expressions, they also had significantly lower levels of activity in the part of the brain that activates anxiety and anger. So I'm arguing that Botox functions as this emotional lobotomy of sorts. Okay, it can emancipate women from having to vigilantly police their facial expressions and actually reduce the negative feelings that produce them. And all of this has implications, too, for how we interact with others. Research suggests that facial expressions may influence not only our own emotions, but those with whom we're interacting with, those who are reading and responding to our facial expressions. This helps to shed light on why Botox appeals not just to women, but also to their intimate partners, their children, their coworkers, their bosses. It rescues these others from having to negotiate the interactive face work with their irritated wives, mothers, and bosses. And this can have some really peculiar consequences. One anthropology professor who I interviewed told me that her teaching evaluation soared after she got Botox. And she joked, half jokingly, that it's because she wasn't able to give her students that "what the hell are you talking about" face. And so in her class, her students now found her friendlier and more deferent, qualities that somehow made her a better professor than the semester before, when she could furrow her brow and express intellectual skepticism. Yeah. So the primary seduction of Botox, particularly for young users, is that it doesn't merely reduce the face's ability to emote in the present, it prevents the appearance of emotion from occurring in the future and from leaving a lasting impression. One way it does this is it actually trains and disciplines the face not to furrow or frown. People told me how they noticed splitting headaches every time they attempted to furrow their brow, so much that it conditioned them to associate this painful stimuli with an attempt to glare. It's very Pavlovian. So training and disciplining the face, Botox conditioned its users to find fault in expressing specific emotions. So these are two different quotes. One person said, "My face knows not to make these expressions now. It's pretty amazing, actually." Another woman said, "You just learn. You know, your face knows not to make these expressions or movements that are going to cause these wrinkles." So this epitomizes how modern technologies become constitutive of self-policing subjects. And it's an example of the ways that disciplinary institutions are literally embodied by its consumers. In much the same way that the constraining corsets of the Victorian era reshaped female torsos by compressing their waists, Botox inscribes gender power relations on the flesh by intervening in the physiological functioning of the body. So in addition to imbuing feminine bodies with cultural norms and values, Botox provided subjects with, to use Foucauldian language, technologies of the self, through which to intervene in their own body's natural processes and to mold them to achieve a culturally valued aesthetic. And just to show you how this works, here's pictures. It's me. And the first picture is before Botox, and you can see that I'm scowling. And the next picture is after. It's about taken 2 weeks after. And I'm trying so hard to scowl there, and I can't. And it's almost like I'm crossing my eyes, okay? And it's actually an incredibly painful experience. So that should give you an idea of how Botox works. So I also talked about how you have to keep getting Botox, okay? And because of the fact that you have to, it's so short-lived, you have to keep going back for more, critics argue that creates a compulsion for repetitive use. And my findings reveal that this concern is not unfounded. This inability to stop using Botox was a sentiment that reverberated throughout my interviews. So I love this quote. This is from a heterosexual male, Robert Moskowitz, and he said, "You know, it's such an amazing dream world that whenever you see Father Time creeping up again, you just don't want to be reminded of reality. So you just want to go back for more." I would ignore the recommended time limits. I would lie about when I last got it. It just puts you in this fantasy land where the realities of age just don't apply to you any longer, just for that temporary period. And so when that starts showing signs of eroding, you definitely have the urge to make a quick call and get right back in that chair and get your fix. When I interviewed Elizabeth Sana, a woman in New Orleans, she said, when I look in the mirror and I see those lines, I'm on the phone with my dermatologist, immediately booking my next appointment. And when I asked her how often she goes back for injections, she said, I'm kind of crack-like about it. Now, of all the quotes in my book, guess which one was picked up by the press? Yeah. But in their defense, they tweaked it a little bit. And it read, doctors say Botox more addictive than crack. So I didn't say that. And it's not necessarily true. And I also want to talk about this metaphor of the drug-addicted body that I weave throughout the book. I do not mean to suggest that people became addicted to Botox in the way that we use the definition in like substance abuse treatment. Rather, the way participants described their addiction to and dependence on Botox reflected a phenomenological use of the term. So viewing Botox addiction through this phenomenological lens illuminates how Botox becomes this embodied custom that dramatically changes one's lived experience, one's sense of autonomy, and one's personal identity. So I'm going to move now and talk a little bit about how Botox users accounted for their participation in Botox. So despite its increasing normalization, Botox still sits at the margins between acceptable and unacceptable body work. It occupies this threshold area, this liminal space between makeup and plastic surgery. Women are allowed right now to enhance their beauty with a certain set of culturally appropriate techniques. Things like nail polish, concealer, hair color, these are acceptable. For some women, Botox might fall into this realm of acceptability, but for most, it's not. And so because of this, it demands some justification from its users. And one such way that people did this was by talking about Botox as a means for improving the enterprising self, as a practical and necessary upgrade to maintain their competitive edge in an intimate marketplaces and in workplace. So I heard things like, appearances are central to this job. My face is like my business card. There is no way I can afford to look tired or old. And this was a cosmetologist who said this. Another woman said, we're not getting married at the age of 23 anymore. We're waiting until we are older. So we need to date for much longer. And we want to look young while we're doing it. I have friends, women who are becoming single after their divorce, and they just have to get that refreshment of Botox to maintain their competitive edge. So I want to note that it was like much more common for women to speak about Botox as a means for achieving workplace success than success in the romantic realm. The desire for career advancement was configured as a much more socially acceptable reason to use Botox and to participate in feminine beauty culture than wanting to get a man or keep a man. However, underlying a lot of these narratives, I did see this theme emerge. Right? It wasn't really feminist to say, like, I'm getting Botox to get a man or keep a man, but it's saying my job depends on it. That's okay. So remember I told you to pay attention to, excuse me, I told you to pay attention to those marketing discourses, and I told you that they were going to resurface. Well, here they are again. Time and time again, I heard the words, it's a personal choice, or I'm doing this for myself. This idea that nobody's forcing me to go and get Botox. And Botox users were really motivated by a desire to carve out a space for themselves where they can be seen as autonomous subjects. They wanted to cast off any rhetoric of coercion, of oppression, or conformity. However, I think that I've shown you that the pressures placed on Botox users to comply with hegemonic beauty norms are painfully obvious. And behind Botox users' adoption of the rhetoric of choice and of agency are sentiments that their Botox use is more accurately an obligation or a necessary component of bodily self-care. Discourses of responsibility were also used to legitimate participation in consumer beauty culture and promoted ideologies that depended on individual subjects to take responsibility for realizing and securing their own well-being. So this is a quote from Alejandro Suarez-Levin. He was one of the younger participants in my sample. He said, if you start early, it prevents these lines from getting deeper. I mean, I would have started earlier if I knew. I mean, look at my 22-year-old assistant. She just started going for Botox. I think she's really smart, starting before the lines even form. So starting at 28 wasn't good enough. Okay. Finally, a handful of women talked about Botox as empowering. One woman said, I think Botox is empowering to women. Botox builds confidence and makes you feel good about yourself. As you may notice here, Botox, women's empowerment is really stripped of any political liberation and reduced to a woman's ability to consume the necessary practices designed to possess an attractive and youthful body. As she articulates empowerment through this post-feminist ideology, post-feminist means like feminism is done. We don't need any more collective activism. We have equality, okay? So Penelope excludes women who are unable to live up to narrow standards of feminine beauty, like poor, overweight, or unattractive women, and those women who are just basically unwilling to embrace and pursue these very narrow standards of femininity. So Botox was not without its tensions. A lot of the women and men with whom I spoke talked about navigating tensions, and they all, I only interviewed Botox users, so they all ultimately sort of capitulated. I'm going to read you this quote. It's a rather long one, so just bear with me. And this is from a anthropology professor. Okay? And she said, this is something that is so fascinating to me, just how profound the impact of cultural norms of attractiveness, particularly in terms of femininity, are, and how complicit I am in the process. People talk so freely and are so blasé about how these are just ideals or norms. And like you have the choice about that whole kind of individualistic frame that is so dominant in our culture. And it's like, no, it's big and it's so powerful. I'm just awed by how powerful these norms are in terms of keeping the decisions that I've made around this stuff. Like, I'm very invested. It's a very big part of my gendered identity in terms of my performance of normative femininity and accommodating to norms of attractiveness and stuff like that. But I don't think that means that I'm stupid or I'm somehow, more of a dupe than other people. I very much resist that critique. So this was a self-proclaimed feminist. And she went to great lengths to justify and rationalize her decision with me. And just so you know, adherence to feminist ideology does nothing to buffer women from their participation in beauty culture. Their justifications just became a lot more elaborate. And so I also use this quote because I want to show you how Botox users are agents of their own beauty as well as beauty objects. Their agency subsists in the process of navigating and managing societal norms that are perceived to be out of their control, out of the individual's control. They are perceived to be fixed and enduring. But here's the problem. Any possibility of individual or collective action or collective resistance is rejected in favor of surrendering to beauty culture and participating in the game even though they didn't make the rules. So no matter how individuals framed their decision to use Botox, whether it was a choice pervaded with tension, whether it was a strategy for developing or enhancing the enterprising self, whether it was couching their decision as an autonomous choice, as a responsible decision, or as empowered, the consequences are the same. Each and every one of the women and men with whom I spoke, including myself, ended up reproducing some of the cruelest aspects of beauty culture. By ultimately deciding to participate in an oppressive, youth-oriented beauty culture, these women reified the structural expectations for which they denied responsibility. Through their efforts to make themselves better versions of themselves, they validated appearance as an indicator of character and sustained an oppressive system that rewards a narrow visual display of bodies and punishes all others. So to wrap it all up, Botox is a feminized cosmetic practice and an enhancement drug. Just like Prozac, Viagra, and human growth hormone, Botox is a drug that enhances the human body beyond what is normal or what is natural. In the same way Viagra is used to construct these optimal masculine bodies, Botox produces ideal feminine bodies. Botox is predicated on blurring the boundaries between the fictive and the real. It represents one of many contemporary cultural conjectures in which the body and technology are conjoined in a literal sense. It straddles the organic and the technological. The Botox body is the prototypical cyborg body. It's a technobody that exposes the postmodern destabilization of the human, non-human binary, and this illusory distinction between nature and culture. The Botox body is more real than real. Okay? It's an enhanced body, and it's a body superior to the normal body. It is seen as preferable to the natural body because the Botox body looks relaxed, awake, and refreshed, even if it is exhausted, stressed, or anxious. So now looking like you isn't good enough. You need to look like you, only better. Like the rise of Prozac and Viagra before it, the increasing popularity of Botox troubles the normal body, making it such that society at large begins to desire and to expect a biomedical or technologically enhanced ideal. Go and watch movies or soap operas from the 1980s or early 90s. You see women's faces move. You don't see that anymore. Botox reflects and reproduces a very specific form of femininity guided by hegemonic beauty ideals. It inscribes subjects with gendered meanings and values. And so it's an ideal site for examining what feminist theorist Anne Balsamo refers to as the technological reproduction of the gendered body. Botox's erasure of the brow creases and frown lines that can cause women to look angry or bitchy fits within a long-standing history of regulating women's bodies to accommodate to societal standards of feminine attractiveness. In much the same way that Victorian-era corsets reshaped female torsos by constricting their waists, and Chinese foot binding remade women's feet to fit with cultural standards of class and beauty, Botox inscribes power relations on the flesh. But where objectification is important to understanding and to theorizing Botox users' experiences of embodiment, so too are their psychosocial processes, their social interactions, and cultural interpretations. The Botox subject is produced within a polemical nexus of sociopolitical contexts, institutionalized arrangements, and structurally created demand. So I want to emphasize that the Botox body is both culturally regulated and voluntarily cultivated, okay? And employing the plurality of this both and approach to understanding Botox reveals how Botox users are both rational agents and herded conformists. And so whenever I told people that I was writing a book about Botox or that now that I've written this book about Botox, the question that I always get is, are you for it or against it? Is Botox good or bad? So I tell them that that's not really my intention, and it's a lot more complicated than that. Instead of asking, is Botox good or bad, I want to ask how Botox exposes the ways that cultural norms and social inequalities are mapped onto bodies, how gender is significant in the production of bodies, and how bodies become the object and the subject of consumption. So hopefully I did that, and you don't have questions about if Botox is good or bad. So without further ado, I'll open the floor to questions.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
You had a slide up there kind of towards the end where two people gave quotes where
You want me to pull it up?
Yeah, if you could. Well, it was the comments where they said that my face has been trained not to frown. Right. So does that mean that when the effects of the Botox wears off, that they're able subliminally, or whether it be through muscle training or something subconsciously, their face doesn't go into those facial expressions even though physiologically they can?
That's exactly what yes, that's
Really?
exactly what happens.
So that's going to put Botox, you don't have to go back. I mean, in theory.
In theory, right? But so eventually, even if you can't make the expression, the lines still return. That's what it is. So yes, so there is this phenomenon where they talk about, and I've felt it too, where your face just sort of gets retrained, not to make certain expressions, but eventually when I haven't had it in a very long time, and so I want to make these expressions again, because it's fun to move your face and express, skepticism. But also the lines come back. And once you see those lines coming back and your brow lowering, you want to go back for more.
I remember when this product first came out that I thought it was a little off-putting that they were capitalizing on the fact that it was a neurotoxin by putting tox in the name of the drug. And I've often wondered why this doesn't seem to bother people, that they're injecting themselves with a neurotoxin.
Yeah. So, so Botox is a derivative of botulism, which is actually the most toxic toxin on the planet. But when used in small doses and diluted, it has this effect. It also has a range of medical uses as well. But, they changed the name. They relabeled it and Botox. It was called something else. I'm blanking on it right now. But and so people were so some people were not even aware. Some people who I spoke to were not even aware that this was a derivative of the deadliest toxin on the planet. However, there were some men and women who were acutely aware that they were injecting a toxin so close to their brain. And these were people who were, prided themselves on their healthy lifestyles, and that they ate all organic diets. They took, very little risk elsewhere. They were vegetarian. And that they sort of found very creative ways to overlook and justify their use of Botox. Like one person said, well, any drug is toxic if used in the wrong doses.
Hi. I was wondering if you had any idea how profitable this industry is.
Extraordinarily profitable. I don't have the exact numbers, but you can buy a provider can buy Botox for like $100 or it's like $100, $200 or something a vial, and then sell it, for exponentially more than that. And so that's why you're able to see, and especially if people, because it goes bad, you have to use it really quickly. And so that's why, particularly in terms of like medical spas, that's why you see them able to offer these deals on it, because that's all they're doing is injecting Botox. Whereas a dermatologist or even a cosmetic surgeon who are doing other things, they, bless you, they're, and also they pride themselves on being more artistic injectors, the prices go up. It's also why in a lot of dermatologists' office, you'll see they have Botox days, because they have to get rid of the product really quickly. This gentleman up here has been raising his hand for.
We get a question from a student
we'll
first.
Come to it. We'll get to it.
Okay.
Hi. So I read your book, and I'm a student of the Center for Global Humanities
Thank you.
kind of program. You're welcome. And my question is kind of like a comment and then a question. So your book and presentation depicts that Botox is kind of become like a common thing that people are doing, and that it's becoming more socially acceptable. It's on that threshold, but for the most part, it is becoming more and more of a social type of behavior. However, in my class when we were discussing it last week, out of, I think there's about 15 of us, 14 of us are women, 20 years old, only one person knew of someone who had done Botox. And so that made me think that we'd all thought that Botox seemed ridiculous at the time. Like, none of us even thought for a second that we might be convinced to get it. But as I was reading your book, like, there are people who were rationalizing getting Botox, and you wouldn't think that that's something that we would ever do. And I'm wondering, and my question is, at what point do you think that our mindset about it might change?
So can you hear me okay without the microphone? So when I started, excuse me, when I started researching this book, I was in my early 30s, and I too said, this is bizarre. And it was still, I only knew a handful of people who had gotten it at that point. This was in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And I too thought it was bizarre, and that I, didn't know that many people. I thought it was something older women did. I thought it was something, only very wealthy people did. And throughout the last 10 years, my perspective has changed dramatically, not just because of all the researches I've done, but also because I am seeing medical spas in places that I wouldn't even imagine. I mean, I was driving through rural Montana 2 years ago, and there were advertisements for Botox, but huge billboards. And so I think it's only going to become more prevalent. And I think that at 20 years old, I wasn't thinking about these things either. And you shouldn't, because I promise you, you will be bombarded with these messages for the rest of your life. So don't think about it right now.
So the model I'm hearing is that there is this ideal of feminine beauty, that women have a social obligation to try to bring their body into congruence with that, and that Botox is sometimes a reasonably effective way to partially achieve that. The question that raises for me is, where does that ideal of feminine beauty arise? Is it fixed? Is it contextual? If so, will a woman who is in a stable relationship with a man and has a lot of intimate contact with him have one ideal? A woman who is dating but not in a stable relationship have a different one? Mm-hmm. Will a lesbian woman in a relationship with another woman have a third?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And so no, ideas about beauty are, fluid and shifting and changing and contextual. And research has found that lesbian women are a bit more protected from these hegemonic beauty ideals, although some research does find that this is changing. There are regional differences. And when you look at the numbers of Botox users, it is what you would expect. It is more in the coastal cities. However, numbers are rising in the middle of America as well. There was like 4 parts of your question, and I want to answer all of them. And so what's really fascinating is that another scholar who's written on this, Abigail Brooks, who wrote a fascinating book called The Ways Women Age. And she interviewed women who are older, so 60 and older, and she interviewed 2 samples of women, half of whom have had cosmetic intervention and half of whom haven't. And what she found, and she's actually from the Northeast, and I think a lot of her data came from the Northeast. And so what she found was that for those women who were refuseniks, it was really difficult. And they had to purposefully surround themselves with other women who shared these same sentiments. And that when one woman in their friendship group either got Botox or filler or something else, it was like a domino effect. Okay? So it's actually not really about the relationship with men. It's actually more about the relationship with women.
Hi. So I read in your book, and you also mentioned in your presentation about the study by Henenlotter. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the implication with the decreased in the amygdala size, and if there could be any negative implications to that.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. As somebody who has had Botox before and is now pregnant, you can't get Botox when you're pregnant because no doctor would ever do that. Risk of lawsuits. I can't even have certain tease. And so, but I've read extensively about this sort of facial feedback effect. And babies really need to read their mothers and, just human beings in general, facial expressions. Yeah. And so I will not get Botox again. And so there are, effects, particularly they've done very small studies of young children's responses to women's and mothers' faces with Botox. And what they found is they have a very difficult time reading their emotions and their affect.
I'm curious about this idea of the responsible consumer that you had brought up at the beginning, because I think I've seen sort of the other side to that as well, sort of in gossip magazines where you see women being shamed for over-Botoxing and sort of the backlash that comes there. It's sort of the damned if you do, damned if you don't, women face everywhere. But I'm curious if any of the women you talked to had those fears or if they reflected on that as well.
Oh, yeah. The specter of the unnaturally overly Botox face haunted Botox users. That was one of the major fears and tensions. It was like, I'm going to look too Botoxed. And there was always one person that they knew, like, oh, she got too much. I didn't get to that in the presentation, but it was like, you're supposed to get Botox, but you're only supposed to get it so that you look like you don't have it. Yeah, and that was a very common theme. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to talk about that. But it's this damned if you do, damned if you don't. Absolutely, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place kind of thing.
So I also read your book, and
Thank you.
I have a question. So you talk about how the FDA approved this in 2002, which means that a lot of users have only used it for about 16 years. My question is there any predictions of maybe a user using this product for 40 to 50 years consecutively, and if that would affect them dramatically?
So still sort of up in the air because it hasn't been around long enough, but there have been small studies and claims that it can cause muscle atrophy in your face. And that repeated use, if you can't move your muscles, then they will atrophy. But also the fact that what happens eventually is that when you express your emotion and you can't pull from a certain place in your face, you will pull from elsewhere. And you know that from the book. I talk about that. And that's why it leads to more and more and more Botox, more filler, more surgery. They call Botox the marijuana of cosmetic enhancements or anti-aging procedures because it's the gateway drug. But so the answer to your question is probably, but they don't know. But that's me saying that. If you ask a dermatologist, and I did ask a dermatologist, or if you ask anyone from Allergan, they will say absolutely not. This product has been around for so many years. We've used it on children with cerebral palsy. Everything's fine.
Or if you ask a physiologist who studies it, yes, they will atrophy.
Okay.
Any denervated muscle will atrophy. What I'd like to explain, if you can, is it's not getting Botox. Is it prescribed as a routine where a whole lot of injections are done as a set number of injections, or is there any thought process that goes into the prescribed injection procedure?
So I'm not quite sure what you're asking. If you're asking when I go to a dermatologist's office and...
I'm saying, do you get the occipita frontalis injected, the procerus injected, do you get other facial muscles injected? You get them all injected, or you get spot treatment?
So this is what oftentimes distinguishes a seasoned injector, and this is coming from the narratives of my participants. This is what distinguishes a seasoned injector from somebody who just took a 3-day course, okay, is that you have to know the symmetry of the face, and you have to understand, you can't just inject Botox in one place. Because what ends up happening is, and this speaks to your question, is the eyebrow tends to raise, and that's called Spock eyebrow, that if you only inject in the glabellar. So if you go to a well-seasoned dermatologist or plastic surgeon, or even somebody who's been doing it for a very long time, they will not only inject you in varying parts of your face, You'll say, I just want Botox here. They'll say, no, you can't get it there. If I do it there, you're going to look weird. And so they'll inject it in multiple parts of the face and then oftentimes give you a package deal with filler.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, it's not only babies who react to expression, but any relationship. So what happens when the individual loses part of their ability to express who they are with that kind of alteration to their presentation of themselves?
Well, I can't speak to what happens to really the individual person, but I can tell you that the example I gave, the way Botox was discovered was it was an ophthalmologist and a dermatologist couple in Canada, the Carruthers, and the ophthalmologist was giving Botox to I think they shared like an administrative assistant, and he was giving Botox to his patients and to her for cross-eyed, because that's what it was used for at that point. And she went in for a checkup, and she said, well, why aren't you injecting me right here? When you inject me there, I don't get this angry expression, and my kids really like it. And my kids say, Mommy, you can't make that really ugly face anymore. And so that's how it was discovered. And so I don't know. I don't know, and I think it's a really fascinating question to see what that does to people when they can't express this negative emotion, when they get this like emotional lobotomy, right? And also what happens to their partners, and to their colleagues.
Can it change the relationship?
I imagine it can. I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. And there's definitely needs to be future research to answer this question.
Okay. I think the scariest part for me is the changing of the emotions, in that if you can't show your facial expression and feeling that anger, that you actually sometimes don't even feel that same kind of anger. It reminds me, the whole time you were talking, it reminded me of Stepford Wives.
Yeah.
And that's all that was coming to mind. But my question is, what's happening on a world level? So what's happening in Europe? What's happening, in Spain or France or even Brazil, or places that would be kind of known
For cosmetic
more for
surgery?
this? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the numbers are higher. And so this is a global phenomenon. I only deal with how Botox is changing the face of America, but it's even more prominent in places like Thailand, Brazil, and in parts of Europe. However, what is different, though, is in Europe, they don't have the direct-to-consumer advertising like we do here. And so it's common, but it's not as talked about.
Hi. Great talk. Thanks so much. Two quick questions. You used gender theory to sort of contextualize or explain the phenomenon. Would you argue that given that women consume so much more cosmetics in general, right, including things like hair coloring and that sort of thing, would you say that the same gender theory would apply as much to those differences, those gender differences? And then secondly, what about the rise of Botox in men, and how do you explain that or describe that using the same theory, or do you?
So it's more than just gender theory, right? I mean, this is an explicitly gendered phenomenon. And so I do draw upon feminist theories to understand why so many more women than men are targets and participants of beauty culture. But it's more than that. It's really about consumer bodies. It's about the biomedicalization of bodies. And when men are the target audience of an advertising campaign for Botox or Brotox, it is oftentimes, gender theory is useful because it is oftentimes couched in ways that you should not feminize men, right? That men's entree in this terrain has to be completely detached from the feminine. And so doctors talked about injecting very differently as to not feminize the face, and there were seminars that they could go to. But also the advertising and marketing to men is very much like, particularly after the recession, There are advertisements and editorials about, this is a way that you cannot look worried or anxious or angry, and you can't afford to do that. And so it was very much couched within this sort of discourses of improving the enterprising self. And so gender theory is useful in terms of theorizing masculinity and how masculinity is always about the repudiation of the feminine. But it's more than just gender theory. It's about theories of consumption and biomedicalization. And I didn't get into that in this talk because I thought it was too theoretical.
I know we lightly touched on the topic of the muscle atrophy for one of the studies, but are there any more long-term studies done specifically related to the brain and the effects that Botox would have on your brain?
So not that I know of, but there, after the book came out, a environmental scientist contacted me, and she had all of these secret studies. I don't know how she had them, but she was like, these are not public. And so we're sort of, so she knows much more about this than I do, because they're buried. They're very buried. So we're gonna do some work in this area and try to maybe do some experiments and show people some videos of what happens long term and see how they respond. So I can't really answer it, but I will one day.
This is the final question, and I'm going to ask it on behalf of a colleague who couldn't make it tonight.
Oh.
And basically, she drew my attention to the fact that there's a beauty pageant for camels in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, who were disqualified for using Botox.
Yeah. Okay, now could you say something about that?
I have no idea what to say about that. I was just absolutely flabbergasted that first of all, there's a beauty pageant for camels. And second, that more than one of these camels was disqualified for getting Botox. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.